Hello, everyone. So nice to see you. I'm so excited to be here with Myriam. I think the last time that we ran into each other was at the airport.
Yes.
Who knows, like, what year that was?
Yeah, it was at the airport in Texas.
I think so. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah.
All I remember is that we were talking about female rage.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. And I think I was sitting at a Panda Express.
Yeah.
And I had just received my fortune. and then I looked up and saw you.
Yeah. Yeah, so good to see you again.
It's great to see you too.
Yeah, so I was thinking a lot about female rage, actually, in this book. And yeah, one of the things that I was thinking about it is there's, for those of you who haven't read Creep, it's just such a fantastic book of essays. One of the things that I really love about this book is how much humor you're able to squeeze in the middle of kind of like the most desperate part of a story. And it's just like a beautiful thing that happens. And the voice in which the book is told in is so strong that it just really feels like each page sort of like singes you in a really kind of beautiful way, like in a really kind of enjoyable way. You know what I mean? Like, you love to be singed, right?
I mean, it's purifying to be plunged into the flames.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I mean. Yeah, I was thinking about how you sort of like arrived at your voice. As I was reading, like, this was one of the things that I was wanting to know more about.
So, you mentioned that I try to gild my work with humor as much as possible, and that wasn't always the case with my voice. I once believed that that I had to write in very serious tones to be taken seriously as a writer. And then I realized nobody was going to take me seriously anyways. Because look at me. So I might as well be true to my nature, which is mischievous. And so I decided to introduce that aspect of myself to the page, but I needed somebody to give me permission to do that. And the person who gave me permission to bring that aspect of myself to the page is the late Tatiana de la Tierra. She was a Colombian poet who has since transitioned to the spirit world. And Tatiana was my friend and my mentor. And Tatiana imbued everything that she did with both humor and mysticism. And so encountering her humor handed me a key. And that helped me to unlock that sort of secret of the page that I had been unable to access.
I love that.
Thank you.
So yeah, so we also were kind of talking like right before the event began about how much we love horror movies.
Yes.
What is do you have a favorite? You're wearing like a Scream one.
I'm wearing a Scream t-shirt. My favorite horror movie, I haven't seen it in a long time. How many faces? Is it the 7 faces of Dr. Caligari?
Oh.
Does he have 7 faces? Is that how many faces he has? Have you seen? Okay, yes. That's one.
I haven't seen that one.
It's good. I like that one a lot. And then, what other horror? I like a lot of the classics too, like Frankenstein and Bela Lugosi's Dracula's.
Yeah, those are good. And I love, in your book you were saying how you have like culturally have like a different relationship to death.
Yes.
And let me see, because I wrote a little bit of it down. You wrote, death is our confidant. Death answers our prayers. You go on to say, like, that we know death well. Death gives us gifts. And yeah, there's an intimacy with the dead that you allowed to inform the book.
Yeah, and there's an intimacy with death too in your book, especially through your mother and her comfort with the world of the dead, and I think that the intimacy with death that I've developed across my lifespan has largely been nurtured by my family. We observe certain death rituals in my household. We honor our muertos on the Day of the Dead. And death was always, well, it wasn't always introduced to us as a toy, but death was a sometimes toy. For example, I remember being a child and my mother taking me to a market in Mexico, and she bought me a toy coffin. And the coffin had a skeleton in repose, and there was a string underneath, and you would pull the string, and the skeleton would sit up, say hi. And so that fostered a very specific type of relationship with death that some of my Anglo friends did not have. In fact, they were kind of frightened to come to our home because on the fireplace mantle, there was an effigy of the god of death, and so friends didn't want to come over for sleepovers. But it was introduced as something not to necessarily fear, like fearing premature death, but death herself, no.
Yeah. Yeah, and in my house, like, sometimes there would be, like, the relatives who had died would have, like, a specific smell, like, when they visited. So one of my uncles, sometimes, like, there would be, like, a mysterious sort of, like, whiskey smell that would just kind of, like, appear in the staircase. Mm-hmm. And, my mother would be like, oh, this is your uncle visiting. And then she would kind of, like, set out a glass of water for him to drink. And I think my dad one time didn't know that was happening, and he drank from it. And then he was like, what happens now? This is terrifying. Like, I've never done this before.
He drank somebody's ofrenda.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
And there's an essay in the book where at the end of it you give your grandfather a voice, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the essay Mitote is an anti-tribute to my grandfather. And I say anti-tribute because I put him up on a pedestal in order to knock him down. My grandfather was both a help and a hurdle. He was in some senses a muse to me because he came from very humble beginnings. He was born to a peasant family in Jalisco, and he aspired to become a man of letters, and he went to seminary and fulfilled that dream. And so that was extremely inspiring to me. At the same time, my grandfather was a misogynist who believed that women couldn't follow in his footsteps. So he had these very large footsteps that we could not fill. And I share in the essay a moment during which my grandfather was interacting with a new friend he had made, and he had been bragging to the new friend that he was a poet, because my grandfather wrote a lot of bad poetry. And so my grandfather was explaining his poetry to his friend, and then one of my cousins was nearby, and my prima chimed in. She goes, Myriam writes too. And my abuelito kind of shut her down, and he goes, ay, mija, yes, Myriam writes, but women lack the sort of vicious fortitude to write well, because in order to be a genius, you need to lead a life of vice. And women are far too virtuous for that. And so I have lived my life to prove my grandfather wrong. And Mitote is my attempt to reckon with his spirit. And so I wrote with spirit when I worked on the essay. So my grandfather left us at age 97. And I spent a lot of time at my ancestor altar speaking with him, saying to him, in life you made a lot of mistakes, but now that you're in spirit form, would you like to correct some of those by walking with me? And he did. And so we co-wrote the essay together, and I used different methods of divination to contact him because he was a writer. And so what I did was I took his words and reconfigured them so that we could have a spiritual conversation with one another. And the conversation was triangulated with Juan Rulfo, who's the author of Pedro Páramo. He was a close friend of my grandfather's. And my grandfather held a grudge against Páramo until the day he died because, not Páramo, against Juan Rulfo, until the day he died because Rulfo supposedly stole my grandfather an encyclopedia set, but there were 2 missing encyclopedias.
I know. I like. It's so funny that that's the grudge. It's like there were 2 missing, and how could he?
Yeah, like my grandfather went to his grave being like, Juan Rulfo was the best Mexican writer who ever walked the face of the earth, but he owes me 2 encyclopedias. And I have this fantasy of giving my aunts and uncles a quiz in alphabetical order to see what they miss, and that way I'll know which encyclopedias Rulfo held out. But my grandfather wrote an essay about his friendship in seminary with Rulfo upon Rulfo's death, and that was the essay that I used for divination. And so it triangulated the conversation between the 3 of us. So it was a conversation with Rulfo and my grandfather through my grandfather's essays.
Oh, that's so lovely. I love that. I was also thinking about my grandfather a lot, obviously, in my memoir. And it is interesting when have like a close relationship to death, as we both do, and you're writing about somebody who's gone. I think that a lot of writers feel a lot of freedom when someone passes away because they're like, oh, they're not gonna, But I don't think that we feel like, like.
Fuck no.
We don't
and
feel that.
This is one of the things
it's like
that
worse.
bugs me.
Yeah.
People will often So young writers will ask me, especially young writers who work in creative nonfiction, are you scared of offending people? I go, not the living ones.
Yeah.
Like they're I'm more scared of offending the dead because they travel faster. You know what I mean?
and they have a lot of time.
That's all they fucking have.
And we don't know, like, what is at their disposal? Like, we don't even know that.
Exactly. And so I'm giving a talk this summer, actually, about how to write for and with the dead, because nobody ever asked me that question, how not to piss them off.
Exactly.
But, you got to watch out.
You do. Yeah. I mean, I remember I had a similar moment, like, of communion. Like, in my book, my mom and my aunts, we'd, like, travel back to Colombia to exhume my grandfather, and there's a moment where his remains are on a tray, and I just had this moment of kind of like kneeling before my grandfather and feeling like there was some sort of like communication happening, and I was sort of constantly asking, like, allow me to tell this story, but also like, how do I tell this story, or how do I find the right phrasing? And he was also a very complicated man, like your grandfather. I think you said your grandfather had a second family
that we know of.
That we know, yeah.
I have a feeling I'm related to a lot of Mexicans.
Yeah. I think when my grandfather passed away, he was a curandero, and he was always leaving the house so that he could go on this trip to visit with other tribes, or get medicine and then return. When he passed away, like, the family was so sure that there were other families, they didn't announce the funeral. Because they didn't want the other families to show up at the funeral. So it was just like, we don't even want to.
And that's wise.
Right?
I mean, it is wise. Like, because in the case of my grandfather, the families were all together.
Yeah.
And the families had been denying one another's existence for decades. And now we had to not just face one another's existence, but look at one another's faces. And that was a form of haunting, too. Yeah. Because I saw my grandfather's face in the faces of strangers. And I was like, I know that nose. I know those lips. I know those hands. Oh, shit, he's here, So it was striking to see all of his progeny gathered around his coffin. I've seen, photos of the funeral, and I'm like, wow, I didn't know I had this many aunts and uncles,
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. And, I think another thing that we have in common that I'd love to talk to you about is also just this I think that for a lot of writers, it's difficult to speak out on abuse, or it's difficult to kind of like hold someone accountable. And you were saying, you said in the essay, like this beautiful part where after kind of going through, like, these are all the things that he has done to my grandmother. These are all the things that he, that he believed about women not being able to write, like all of these things. And then at some, I think close to the end, you're like, abuelito te busco, te tengo flores, tenemos flores. And later on you say, like, I don't hate you. Like the reason I am writing this is because I love you. And so I think we have a very similar understanding of what it means to be in relationship to someone who has been abusive.
Absolutely.
And how there's a way to hold them accountable, while kind of like holding the complication of your relationship to that person.
Absolutely. And I struggled to do that for each of the creeps that I wrote about.
Some creeps would be harder than others.
Some creeps were much more challenging. And one of the tricks that I use when writing about extremely difficult people, especially people who have committed acts or lived lives that might be interpreted as radically evil, sort of one of the practices or tricks that I fall back on is thinking of that person in infancy. Because in infancy, they had not become that yet. And so I can experience compassion for that infant, and then that becomes a doorway into writing about that person in a humane way. And the other thing that I sometimes do too, when I have to push myself to write about a person who has especially harmed me, and I want to write about them in a humane way, is to think about that person's children.
Yeah. And do you have somebody in your family who models or who modeled that for you? Sort of like accountability and that kind of like, I guess like social justice is what it would be.
Yeah. Let's see. I think I would say that the person who has best modeled that for me in my family is one of my cousins. And I write about her in an essay titled Locas. My cousin Desiree is what we call in Spanish prima hermana, meaning she's a cousin so close she's like my sister. And my cousin has experienced tremendous suffering in life. She's an incest survivor. And as a result of that, she sought family, and she found family in a gang in East Los Angeles. And as a result of her involvement in that gang, she spent 15 years incarcerated. She's been to every women's prison in California. And she has taught me quite a bit about how to be a phoenix, how to rise from the ashes, and how to forgive, but not to forget.
Yeah, I think that's the difference. The person for me who modeled that would be my mother. And I think she was just really good at holding people accountable, accessing her anger. There's another beautiful thing that you say here about anger. I think you say, I also wrote this down, rage. It seemed to me that making room for rage was the compassionate thing to do. Without rage, how do people heal? Without rage, how does one produce dignity?
Yeah.
And it's so important to allow yourself, to go through those feelings and be angry and have the reaction that you want to have. And for me, it was, I think when my mother was young, and she would have been. She was pregnant at the time, and then my dad was very abusive, like when they first got together. And one of the things that he would do is that he would lock her in the apartment and then just go off to work. And then he would come back, and she would say, like, why did you lock me in? And he would go to the door and like mime, that it was, he would be like, but it's open. So then he would be like, you're crazy, basically. Yeah. And like I think that there's, like in my family, like that story was never hidden from us. Yeah. It was always like a thing that we spoke about. And so I think from her, I learned that there's, like when we are silent about those sorts of stories, you're like protecting someone's feelings, yes, but you're also like protecting abuse.
Yeah.
So it becomes so important to kind of like break silence on that, hold someone accountable,
Absolutely.
whatever their feelings. And when I was writing my memoir, and was telling my dad, like, that's like part of the part of the thing that I'm gonna write. He was so understanding of it, and I think it's only because when you give an opportunity to someone, because you love them, you hold them accountable, and then you give them an opportunity to change through that kind of like rage and accountability.
Absolutely.
And then they can become a different person. So I only think that he was able to become a different person because of my mother's anger,
Absolutely. That section where I wrote about rage comes from the title essay, which I place at the end of the collection, the long essay, Creep. And it chronicles my experience of surviving domestic violence. And I trace its trajectory from start to finish. And I invite the reader to sort of join me in that fog of confusion that envelops you. And that the abuser sort of breathes into your life. And once you're inside of it, you don't know where the exit is, because when you're in the fog, the exit can be 100 miles away. It also might be right there, and you don't know. And so I think that fog is an ideal metaphor for the confusion and the chaos of domestic violence. And when I was experiencing it, I often had to numb myself in order to be able to tolerate the psychological terrorism, but also the physical and the sexual terrorism that I was subjected to, because there was quite a bit of physical violence. For example, I had broken teeth, I had a broken arm, I have back injuries, I had head injuries, I was strangled. And to tolerate that, I had to numb myself. And when I lost the ability to numb myself and I began experiencing flashes of rage, that was when I began to consider liberation.
Yeah.
But in my numbness, I could not contemplate liberation. I needed that flame burning beneath me to spur me to leave.
Yeah.
And so this is why I think that it is incredibly important for people who are surviving violence to be fucking angry about it, because that's what saves your life.
Yeah, I know. It's tough for that. And you were also talking about you were writing, I think, Mean.
Yes.
As that was going on.
Yeah.
And you talked about that being a refuge of sorts, like
Yes.
a way to escape what was happening was,
Yeah.
But then you were also writing a very difficult story. And
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you want to
Yeah,
talk about
so when I was working on this collection, when I was working on my last book, the book prior to Creep, it was a memoir, Mean. And that memoir is about the first 30 years of my life. And it also includes an incident that happened in 1996. I was assaulted by a stranger who is now incarcerated in San Quentin. He was a serial rapist and a very young serial killer. He was apprehended when he tried to abduct a victim at knife point. So I wrote about the impact of that assault on my life when I wrote Mean. And I was attempting to work through the sense of being haunted by that perpetrator's victim. And I did that while I was surviving domestic violence. And when I did press for Mean, very often I would be asked whether or not writing Mean had healed me. And I was so bothered and perplexed by that question, because it suggests that the female writer who writes about pain is like a vessel, and I'm filled with pain up to here. And then if you tip me over and pour it out onto the page will absorb it. And there's some sort of radical transference that happens that is just simply not true. Yeah. That's not what the act of writing does. It can provide some relief, but it doesn't necessarily empty you. And I felt as if that's what people were asking. And then the second aspect of that question that was so disturbing to me was that if a person doesn't know under what circumstances a work of art was created, why would they assume that it's inherently healing?
Yeah.
Like, art making can be evil. So unless you understand under what conditions it was made, make no assumptions unless you know.
Yeah. And there's many ways in which you write something and it actually can be re-traumatizing.
Absolutely.
You know, like there's things that I've written where it's been really hard to write it, and then it's also like you always kind of like run the danger of just re-traumatizing yourself.
Yeah. And
going there.
Yeah, when I was working on Mean, I decided to access legal documents around the case, and they were documents that I had never wanted to look at. And then I wanted to incorporate certain details into the book, and so I read the victim's autopsy report. And that was an incredibly traumatizing moment. Yeah. Can we go on? Are we cool? Okay. Okay.
Sorry, that I was like, what happened? One of the I think that it's almost like what's underlying that question is the reason why we make art is to heal ourselves, and that's not always the reason. Like, I think that it might be for some people, but the reason why I make art is to make art.
Yes.
Right. I don't. I'm not trying to sort of do like a psychological, like a self-therapy, for myself.
Yeah, like for me, therapy is therapy and art is art.
Yeah, exactly.
And they might have points of overlap, but they're not one and the same. And also, I don't tend to find healing in the act of art making. I find it in other embodied practices.
Yeah.
Like cooking.
Yeah.
And walking.
Yeah. And I think with memoir, like one of the things that I really love doing when I'm writing memoir is not only like telling the personal story, but that moment when you find out how your personal story clicks and is connecting to the world, and there's a larger meaning suddenly.
Yes.
And that is what I care about. Right?
Absolutely.
Because then it's sort of like you're creating a map for how to read yourself and your life, but you're also creating a map for how to read the world.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes when it comes to sexual violence, domestic abuse, understandings of women and like history, there's like so many misreadings and misunderstandings that creating like that new map is so. I think that's why I do it. Like that's so invigorating, and that's when I feel the work is urgent and important.
I have a question for you about truth, because your memoir focuses on curanderismo and phenomena that could be described as supernatural, and I know that. Reading that sort of truth can be very challenging to people who don't know how to lift the Western gaze. And in some ways that intersects with challenges in my work. When we write about sexual violence or domestic violence, we're typically writing about events that have taken place without an audience. And so again, people challenge, is this true or is it not? And then there are also some supernatural elements in my work as well that have been troubling to people who can't transcend that Western lens. So I was curious about responses to your work and people challenging the truth that you channel through curanderismo.
Yeah, that I had to work on that a lot, and I think that I had to write my memoir thinking about, what would an outsider of, to curanderismo, like how would they approach this book? And I'm talking about my grandfather, like knowing plant medicine, but also things like, people said that he could move clouds. And so I think that the way that I approached it was, getting, interviews with people who had, for example, like seen him move clouds. Mm-hmm. And then I'm in like the facts of what somebody has said. And one of the things that I had to like really, the way that I was able to do it was think about how there's this misunderstanding that the Western gaze is the truth. Mm-hmm. what I had to do, or like my project as a writer, was to like modify that a little bit and say it is a cultural understanding, and just as there is the Western understanding of truth, there are other cultural understandings of truth, and I'm gonna like tell you about like the Colombian understanding of that. And I, like one of the things that is like really important in my family are like dreams, and I just grew up with my grandmother telling this dream that she had like the day that my grandfather died. And as I've said earlier, like they had a very toxic relationship, and they were like separated at the end, and she had suffered so much in her life with him. But that day that he died, she dreamt that he like returned to her, and that they made love on her bed, and he asked, will you forgive me? And she was like, basically like, hell no. and and then when she woke up, she, like she said this story like so many times. When she woke up, there was dirt all over her bed, and there was mud in her underwear. And so the way that she would like finish this story is by saying like, now I know what it's like to make love to a ghost. And so I think, for maybe like if you grew up, not in our cultures, like that would maybe like wouldn't affect your daily life. But for someone like my grandmother, that dream affected, like sort of like was the final moment of their relationship, right? Like
It was a
it's
defining moment.
It was a defining moment, and it's so impactful for her, and it was like the truth for her.
Yeah.
And so I think as I was writing the book, I was fighting to make space for these other ways of understanding and seeing the world, right? And so then that's when it becomes like really important and urgent, like this the truth telling and.
Yeah. I was thinking about a specific moment where you write about Mommy, your mother, falling into a well, and how there was like a spectral blue hand, a pretty one, that knocked her in. And so that absolved all the kids of responsibility for having potentially done that. Yeah. And then there was doubt about whether or not the hand was real. And in my essay about my grandfather, Mitote, his hand appeared to me, just his disembodied hand.
That's
and
great.
A lot of folks think that I'm writing about a metaphor. No. Yeah. My grandfather's hand came to me, and it floated in front of me, and it said, afuera, get out. And I've when people have critiqued this book, that's one of the essays that they take issue with, because they don't know if that's metaphor or not. No, it's not metaphor. It's his disembodied hand came.
Yeah, it's fascinating, just because there's always like, we're always saying like we want diverse books and we want like diverse storytelling, and then I tell you
about my grandfather's disembodied hand and you don't believe me.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, if you're gonna invite us in, you have to deal with the consequences of inviting us in.
Okay, cool.
Oh, amazing. Yeah. So I think we're gonna turn to audience questions, and there's a mic over here. If anybody wants to come over to the front and ask anything. Yeah.
Hi, I love your work. And in Creep, you write about humor, and humor as a tool for reorganizing social space. So what do you hope to accomplish with the way that you use humor in your work, and what reorganization of social space do you strive for?
Oh my goodness. Thank you for that question. I love talking about humor. It also is like the unfunniest thing in the world to analyze humor. One of my goals in using humor to write about gender-based violence and sexual violence is to help facilitate conversations that survivors often feel alienated from when they are pushed to talk about the worst experiences of their lives without any humor. Right? If I'm going to talk about the most horrifying moments of my life, I would like a crutch. And that crutch is humor. And I've relied on humor as a crutch my whole life. And I do believe that that's what's kept me alive in many respects. and I honor, the spirit of humor for having gifted me with that. And so I offer that to other survivors, and I give that to them as a gift, so that they can use it as a protective salve too.
Thank you. There's such a great quote. Yeah, if anybody you want to go over to, yeah. I just wanted to read another beautiful quote that you wrote. Humor lets me approach rape. Those of us who think about it a lot need to get near it, close enough to wet it with my squirting flower. Yeah. I love that.
Thank you.
But yeah, humor is so important. I think South Americans, Mexicans, Central Americans, we tend to have like such morbid, dark humor.
Yes.
And it's such a beautiful, I would love for that to be the stereotype about us.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you. Ingrid and Myriam, bravo. I really appreciate the courage that you've had to write your books. I was, in my book, Out of the Bronx, I had an issue with the abuse from my mother, and that was a real hard one. But I'm wondering how you dealt with fear, because in my culture, I had a lot of you better not tell or I'll haunt you from my grave kind of thing. So I wonder, I don't hear a lot of fear and anger with regard to the obstacles in writing your book. Can you comment on that?
Yeah. So what I have found, and thank you so much for that question. And also, I love your hat. That's a great hat. What was I going to say about fear? There is a Mexican saying that they took so much from us that they also took our fear. And I kind of feel like I got to a point where I embodied that. Like, there was a point at which, when I was still experiencing domestic violence, there was a day that I sort of woke up and I thought, I can be murdered for making the bed wrong. I would rather be murdered trying to run for my life and liberate myself rather than for making the bed wrong. And that was sort of a moment that was extremely galvanizing for me.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that there's something with humor that really allows for, to deal with fear in a different way. I think that, growing up in Colombia, there was like so much violence. And I just did like a reporting trip this past December, and I was talking to women who had survived a massacre, and we like got close to where it happened, but not very close. And they just wanted me to see like the road that they had like walked down on. And we just like stood there and like looked at this road, and then we got back in the car where we were, riding together, and then the driver, as a joke, started to head in the direction of like the site of the massacre, and we all just like burst out laughing, and he was like, also just like, that was the prank, and we didn't even like talk about pranks, but there's like there's a way in which, when things are so distressful, there's a way in which laughter is almost like this protective shawl that like just really allows you to move through the processing of something that's like really difficult to do.
Yeah, this also reminds me of my first funeral. The first funeral that I went to was for one of my cousins. He had been murdered. He was 15 years old, and so that was my first funeral, right? And I remember, so we go to the funeral mass, and then we drove to All Souls in Long Beach. And so we're walking across the cemetery to get to his grave to bury him, and one of my cousins was wearing stiletto heels in a cemetery. So she starts going down, right? And she goes, they're pulling me down, And everybody's all, shut up, Laura. And then she was wearing yellow stilettos, a black miniskirt, and a yellow shirt. And then my gay primo goes, Laura came dressed as a motherfucking bumblebee. And I was like, oh my God. And then my dad was looking at all of us like, who else wants to die? Yeah, so that's how we cope.
That's how we
That's
cope,
just
yeah.
how we cope.
Okay, yeah, and this would be our last question.
Hi, thank you so much. I wanted to ask, 'cause since you both seem to spend a fair amount of time here in the U.S. and North America, and yet in all your writing, it's got this very distinct Latin American voice. And one of the things that I've really loved about both your books is that they've helped me connect to my Latin American perspective. I'm half and half, but I've lived my whole life in this country, and sometimes I lose that sense. And reading your books has helped brought it back for me. So I was wondering, how do you balance those two perspectives, and how do you not lose the Latin American perspective when you spend time here in the U.S.?
Thank you so much for that question. I think for me, because I lived in South America until I was 19, it feels like all of my formative years, like my psychology, my heart, like my language, is completely, South American. And I think that it was. I used to keep count on like how many years I had been in South America and how many here, and I was very scared of the moment where they would equal, and like then it would be like I've spent more time here than I have there, because I didn't know. I'm like, what do I explode? Like what happens at that point? And yeah, turn into a pumpkin. So I don't know. So I think that there's things that I can identify in myself that are very South American, and maybe like the way to keep the connection is identifying and knowing what those things are, like the things, humor and this relationship to death that's very different, and this ability to laugh in the middle of darkness, like all of these things are very South American. So I think that being able to kind of tell them apart a little bit, and being able to name them and hold them, and hold reverence actually for them, I think that's the way to like keep the connection.
Okay, cool. Let's
Yeah.
do it then.
So thank you so much for being here with us. You were such a lovely audience. Myriam and I are going to sign books in Pegasus right over here. And thank you all. Thank you, Myriam.
Thank you.